Hello everybody and welcome back. Thank you very much for joining me. A woman driver feels sheer terror before seeing a very tall, shaggy brown, fur-covered shape. Hello everyone and welcome back. Thank you for joining me. I hope you're all well and keeping safe, and I would like to thank everyone for tuning in tonight. This next witness report is written by the witness herself, in her own words, and her name is Deborah Singleton, and she's happy to be named. Deborah is a BBR member, and she's happy to chat about her experiences she's had through life. Like me, Deborah searched for other witnesses to the strange and the paranormal. Deborah said, "My hubby and I were visiting friends who live about 50 miles away from us on the other side of York. I was the designated driver that night, so I was on soft drinks all evening. It was around 1:30 a.m. when we set off home. My hubby was rather inebriated, so he fell asleep 5 minutes into the journey. I was driving along the A64 home. The fog was rolling in off the fields, in large thick patches, which was suddenly clear and then return. I was wide awake and I didn't feel in the least bit tired. The rest of the journey was relatively trouble-free, although I did have a rather nagging feeling of unease, which I just couldn't explain. I wondered if it was because the roads were lonely. I had no one to chat to as my husband was still fast asleep, and I just had the radio on for company. And the unease continued with no real explanation until we were around about 7 miles from home. The time was approaching 2:30 a.m. and thankfully the uneasy feeling started to lift a bit as I knew we were nearly home. It was replaced with a feeling of almost relief until I got to the Horsforth roundabout. This was around 2:45 a.m. As I started to approach down the hill in the direction of Rodley, I began to feel overwhelmingly terrified. The nearer I got to the dip in the valley, the more the panic was rising. There was no explanation for all of this. I tried to wake my hubby with no success. I tried to get a grip of myself to no avail. There were no cars around at all. In fact, when I thought back, I hadn't seen another car on the road in either direction for at least 3/4 of an hour. With the sheer terror beginning to escalate, I was almost at the bridge when I saw it. I say saw because I didn't dare look at it directly. I had the overwhelming feeling that if I looked at it, I would die. Standing at the side of the road and looking directly at me was a very tall, shaggy, brown or black, fur-coloured shape. At my estimation, it must have stood over 2 metres tall, and it was about 1.2 metres wide, with no visible limbs or eyes that I could see. But I sensed that the eyes were there somewhere, as I could feel them boring into the car. Needless to say, I had to get away from this thing, so I accelerated away from it. And as I passed where it was standing, I stared straight ahead, not daring to turn my head and look left. I looked back in the rearview mirror to see it step off the curb and into the road where I'd just driven. By the time I reached our house, I was panic-stricken. I needed to get inside and lock the door. My husband couldn't understand what was wrong with me. I explained what had happened, but he said that it was probably a tree and my mind was playing tricks on me. I know what I've seen, and it was no tree. How could a tree make me so scared? And it stepped into the road. Trees cannot do that. They cannot step out. The next morning, in the cold light of day, and with a sense of apprehensive curiosity, I decided to drive back to the spot and see if there had been a tree there, just to make sure. But as I suspected, there was nothing there, nothing that I could have misinterpreted. And the story doesn't quite end there. I decided to research and write a book a few months later, And the book was about other people's paranormal experiences in my area of the country. I'd placed an advert and I had a feature in our local paper, including my horror story, and asking for people to write into me with theirs. I had a lot of responses, and many people answered and shared mainly UFO sightings with me. But then one day, I opened a letter that made my blood run cold. A young man wrote to me to say that he works at the supermarket a couple of miles away. He was on the twilight shift between 8 p.m. and 2 a.m. He frequently walked home from work, and on that night, he was on the last third of his journey as he passed the end of my street and down into the village. Around 400 metres from my house is our village church, which is opposite a row of shops. As he had approached the church, he saw two figures crouching in the middle of the road. He slowed down to an almost stop, and there were no cars around at all. At first, the figures didn't appear to notice the young man. He said they made no sound. Then they looked up at him and stood up and walked away towards the shops and around the back of them. He followed behind them, and as he rounded the corner a few seconds later, they'd gone. The figures he described were exactly the same as the one I'd seen that night on the drive home. I had no idea what I saw or what the young man saw, but the terror that event caused me will stay with me forever. I chatted with Deb about that evening and about her experiences and what it's like to look for others who experience the strange things that you do and how it affected her life, and she went on to add, "Looking back, I'm so glad I was in the car now. I don't know if I would have coped with the event if I'd encountered it on foot. The area I saw it in has apparently had some similar reports from people who have heard weird noises. Someone else reported seeing a furry thing. Someone suggested that it was the ghost of a monk that would be dressed in animal furs at Kirkstall Abbey, which is just down the road. Apparently, I think it was on Dogman Encounters that Vic read out a report from a woman in Rawdon, which is very near the location of my encounter, and she said she had to swerve the car to avoid hitting a dogman. The other thing that creeps me out a bit is that hidden down the lane in Rawdon is a temple belonging to the Order of the Golden Dawn, Aleister Crowley's invention. It's said he used to conjure demons and entities in the building there. This ties in for me with the Bempton RAF base and the strange tales of satanic cults there, and all manner of strange things happen down on the base and the cliffs. It makes you wonder if there's something in that. People say it can't be flesh and blood, can't be a flesh and blood creature, or it's interdimensional. That thing I saw was definitely solid. I 100% believe these things exist. I just don't know how. As a side note, I've always been scared of what would be termed werewolves ever since I can remember. This must be some sort of genetic memory, as I wasn't exposed to horror films as a child, because my family weren't into them. Bramham is about 10 to 15 miles away from me, and I'm sure there was another report from out that way. And the report Deborah refers to is a report made by a gentleman walking his dog one evening when a huge hairy humanoid figure stepped out of the trees and into the path in front of him. Deborah went on to explain that another brief sighting of something strange was one she'd had a few months back. She said, "My hubby and I were out on the motorbike. We were somewhere around the Selby area, and as I looked through a break in the hedge we were passing, I saw an orangutan-coloured animal. It was crouched down, scooping up water out of what looked like a small fishing pond surrounded by reeds. The traffic was too busy to be able to turn around, unfortunately. It definitely wasn't a farm animal, as it looked like the edge of an arable field and there were no animals. Its hair was too orange and too long to be anything that we would recognise in this countryside." Now, the orange creature of the second report is mentioned often, this orange colour. Sometimes described as like an orangutan or a red setter dog. Cows are also that colour. However, I noticed Deborah used the words hands to describe the drinking that the creature did. The cupping and using of hands is a very human action. And also simians and the great apes do the same thing. Another thing of note is the mention of figures seen in the churchyard. Dogmen are often seen near graveyards and ancient burial sites. The hairy thing in the report sent to Deborah took place at the Abbey. The young gent walking home saw two figures as he passed the church near Deborah's home. Now, there are many reports worldwide of bipedal canines around burial sites, old and new. But not all of the reports are exclusive to canines. There are other creatures also mentioned. Some have wings, others have red glowing eyes, and in some cases Bigfoot-like creatures. But the majority of creatures seen around graveyard sites tend to be upright, bipedal, canines, wolves, werewolves, whatever you want to call them. They're often spotted around RAF base. RAF Alconbury is a prime example of the standing wolf. Bempton and the RAF bases have reports of cryptid creatures. In the case of Bempton, it's theorised that the dark magic practice there has opened up a doorway, or a number of doorways, and all manner of things have come through. Now, the mention of alchemy and summoning is something I find of interest, as it's mentioned here in the northwest. John Dee was a well-known summoner of all things, and he just happened to do some summoning in two areas here that also have multiple Bigfoot reports. Many witnesses express remembering an early childhood fear. If you remember, Deborah said that she was terrified of werewolves and she never knew why. Or a feeling of being drawn to creatures as children who eventually go on to experience these creatures in later life. I've taken a report of a young girl who dreamt she was chased by a red-haired yeti. Many people have this fear of the unknown when they're a child, and then they have an event with it much later on. I remember one witness who had such a fear of wolves, she made her father remove the invisible wolf each night before bed, who eventually, as a teenager, saw a sickly wolf-like creature. Many other people also mention their children or grandchildren experiencing wolfmen or monkey men coming into their rooms at night. They wonder if this is their interest in the subject that has caused the visit. But we shall leave that for another time and another witness report. Many of you have asked me if I think the lockdown in place will slow down the reports of cryptid creatures coming into BBR, and what effect the lack of public will have on them now there are far less people out and about. Even in this short time, there has been a massive improvement for our wildlife. Less cars and people have brought many animals into towns, and even closer to homes, the air is much cleaner. Today is the 31st of March 2020, and only 3 days ago, on the 28th, I took a report from a gentleman in Scotland of a tall, all one-coloured, large figure that was spotted by the man when he was collecting wood at 7:15 p.m. I will bring you further details on this report and any others that come into BBR in the next few days. Please share this video on your social media groups or sites. Click like or describe, and don't forget to click that bell for immediate notifications. Thank you very much for tuning in, and I will speak to you all next week. Good night, everyone.